In 1892, a mother stood in a doctor's office in Louisville, Kentucky, holding a letter she'd written in shaking handwriting. Her son was 16 years old and already 7 feet 9 inches tall. His bones ached constantly. He couldn't find work, and she was begging the doctor not to report his condition to the medical journals because she knew what happened to people like him. They didn't get help, they got put on display. Her name was Anna Swan Bates, and her son, who history barely remembers, was one of the last true giants born before the medical establishment figured out how to stop gigantism cold. But this isn't a story about medicine saving people. It's a story about how an entire industry built on human suffering collapsed the moment doctors realized they could cure the very condition that made their employers rich. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand how economic incentives shape what we call progress, hit subscribe now. Next week, I'll show you the even darker story of how early radium treatments were deliberately withheld from patients because radium poisoning created better autopsy specimens than radium cures. But first, let me show you what really happened in 1892. Anna Swan Bates wasn't a nobody. At 7 feet 11 inches tall, she'd spent 20 years being exhibited in dime museums, circus sideshows, and P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York. She'd toured Europe, met Queen Victoria, and earned what would be close to $2 million in today's money. She knew the business of human exhibition from the inside. And when her son started growing past normal height at age 12, she made a decision that confused everyone around her. She pulled him out of public view entirely. The reason wasn't maternal instinct, it was cold economic calculation. Because Anna had watched what happened to giants who couldn't control their own exhibition contracts. She'd seen them die broke, their bodies claimed by medical schools before their families could bury them. The human exhibition industry wasn't just exploitative. It was a futures market in human remains, and Anna refused to let her son become inventory. But by 1892, the entire system was about to collapse, because a French doctor named Pierre Marie had just published a paper describing a tumour on the pituitary gland that caused abnormal growth. He called it acromegaly. And within 5 years, surgeons in Berlin and Vienna were removing those tumours, stopping gigantism before it killed. The medical establishment celebrated this as progress. The exhibition industry saw it as an existential threat, because if you could cure giants, you couldn't profit from them. What most people don't know is that the early treatments for gigantism weren't kept secret because they didn't work. They were kept secret because they worked too well. Medical schools that had spent decades collecting giant skeletons suddenly had a financial incentive to delay treatment. Circus owners who'd invested thousands in long-term contracts with tall performers actively discouraged families from seeking surgical intervention. And insurance companies refused to cover pituitary surgery on the grounds that excessive height wasn't a medical emergency. It was a pre-existing condition. Anna Swan Bates understood this better than anyone. She knew that the moment her son's condition appeared in a medical journal, he'd become a target, not for help, for acquisition. Agents for dime museums would show up offering contracts that locked performers into decades of exhibitions with no residuals and no control over their image. Medical researchers would request invasive examinations that would be published without consent. And after death, there would be a bidding war for the skeleton. So she went to a doctor she trusted, a man named Howard Kelly, who'd trained under the same European surgeons who were pioneering pituitary treatment, and she asked him to do something that violated every norm of medical publishing at the time. She asked him to treat her son in secret. No photographs, no case studies, no mention in the medical literature. If Kelly could remove the tumour and stop the growth, she'd pay him triple his normal fee. But if he published, she'd make sure every giant family in America knew he couldn't be trusted. Kelly agreed. And what happened next reveals the economic forces that actually shaped early endocrinology, because Kelly didn't treat Anna's son out of humanitarian concern. He did it because he was being frozen out of the medical establishment for refusing to participate in the skeleton trade. Other surgeons were building entire careers on giant autopsies. Kelly wanted to build his career on giant survival. And Anna's offer gave him the funding to experiment with techniques that teaching hospitals wouldn't touch, because dead giants were more valuable than living ones. The surgery took place in a private clinic in Baltimore in the summer of 1893. Anna's son underwent a procedure that was technically illegal under Maryland medical licensing laws because it hadn't been approved by the state board. Kelly removed a tumor the size of a walnut from the base of the boy's brain. The growth stopped immediately. Within 2 years, the boy had gained weight, his bone pain subsided, and he was able to work as a carpenter, a profession that required fine motor control his hands hadn't been capable of before surgery. But the success stayed secret because if word got out that gigantism was curable, the entire economic model of human exhibition would collapse. And it did collapse, just not for another decade. What killed the freak show wasn't moral progress or changing public tastes. It was medical intervention. Once surgical techniques for treating pituitary tumors became standardized in the early 1900s, the supply of new giants dried up. Families who would have had no choice but to exhibit their children in 1890 could get them treated in 1910, and the exhibition industry went into terminal decline. The circus owners and museum operators knew this was coming. Internal documents from Barnum and Bailey show that management was actively lobbying medical schools to restrict access to pituitary surgery. The argument they made was economic efficiency. Treating one giant cost thousands of dollars and benefited one family. But exhibiting that same giant generated revenue that supported hundreds of workers. Saving the giant, they argued, destroyed jobs. And in the crude calculus of industrial capitalism, the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. This argument worked longer than it should have. Between 1895 and 1910, there are documented cases of families being denied surgical treatment for gigantism on the grounds that the procedure was experimental, even though European surgeons had been performing it successfully for years. Insurance companies used the same logic to deny coverage. If gigantism could be exhibited profitably, then treatment was cosmetic, not medical. And cosmetic procedures weren't covered. Anna Swan Bates spent the last decade of her life fighting this logic. She used her fame to fund surgical treatment for at least 12 other giant children whose families couldn't afford Kelly's fees. She wrote letters to medical journals arguing that doctors had an ethical obligation to treat rather than study. And she kept her son's identity hidden because she knew that the moment the exhibition industry found out he'd been cured, they'd use him as proof that surgical treatment destroyed economic opportunity for the disabled. That argument wasn't about compassion. It was about maintaining a labor supply, because the industry wasn't paying giants for their labor, it was renting their bodies. A typical exhibition contract from the 1890s gave the performer a salary, but ownership of all photographs, all measurements, all medical data, and all post-mortem remains belonged to the company. If you signed with Barnum, your skeleton was company property before you died. Families had to buy back their relatives' bones. Anna knew this because she'd signed one of those contracts when she was 19. The case, Swan versus Barnum, wasn't decided until 1884, 16 years after she'd first tried to terminate the agreement. And the ruling was narrow. Barnum retained rights to any photographs or publicity materials created during the contract period, which meant that even after Anna retired, Barnum was still making money from her image. She couldn't control how she was represented because she'd signed away that right when she was a teenager. When her son was born in 1876, Anna made sure he was never photographed. And when he started growing abnormally at age 12, she moved the family from Ohio to Kentucky to get away from agents who were already trying to sign him to contracts. The boy's father, Martin Van Buren Bates, was himself a giant at 7 feet 9 inches. He understood the industry's brutality, but he also understood that without medical intervention, their son would die young. Giants rarely lived past 40, so Martin and Anna made a pact. They would use their exhibition earnings to fund their son's treatment, but they would never exhibit him. And they would fight to change the legal framework that made human bodies into tradable commodities, because the laws governing medical research in the 1890s were designed to benefit researchers, not subjects. If a doctor examined you, he owned the data. If a photographer took your picture in a medical context, the image belonged to the hospital. And if you died while under medical care, your body could be used for teaching purposes without family consent. Anna and Martin knew about these agreements because they'd both been approached by medical collectors while they were still alive. Offers to purchase their skeletons after death. The amounts offered were insulting. $200 for Anna's skeleton, $300 for Martin's. When Anna pointed out that circus owners had paid her $50,000 over her career for the right to exhibit her while alive, the medical collector said that was different. Exhibition was entertainment, research was science, and science served the greater good. This rhetoric of the greater good was everywhere in late 19th century medical writing. It justified everything from grave robbing to non-consensual experimentation, and it was used specifically to deny treatment to people whose conditions were considered scientifically interesting. There are cases from this period of patients with treatable tumours being refused surgery because the tumour's progression was being studied. The patients would die, but the data would advance medical knowledge. Anna's son was offered this same trade in 1892, before Kelly agreed to operate. A researcher from Johns Hopkins wanted to document the progression of his gigantism through annual examinations. In exchange, the family would receive a small stipend, but there was no offer of treatment for the gigantism itself. The researcher's goal was to study untreated progression until death, then acquire the skeleton for the university's collection. Anna said no, and the researcher's response was telling. He argued that refusing to participate in medical research was selfish. Anna's response, recorded in a letter she wrote to a friend, was blunt. She said that doctors who wanted to study her son for free could pay him the same rates circus owners offered, as $50 a day plus travel expenses, and if they wanted his skeleton after death, they could negotiate with his estate like any other buyer. This transactional framing of medical research was radical for its time. It treated the patient's body as property with economic value, which went against the entire ideological foundation of medical altruism. But Anna had spent 2 decades in an industry where bodies were explicitly commodified. She knew what her son's body was worth, and she refused to pretend that medical research was somehow more noble than entertainment, when both industries profited from the same human raw material. What protected Anna's son in the end wasn't law or ethics. It was Anna's fame and her willingness to weaponize it. She let it be known that any doctor who published information about her son without consent would be publicly identified as someone who exploited families for professional gain. Newspapers loved stories about Anna Swan Bates. She was a celebrity. If she said a doctor had betrayed her trust, that doctor's reputation would suffer. This worked because Anna had something most patients didn't have. She had social capital, but the vast majority of families dealing with medical exploitation had no such power. They were poor, uneducated, and had no access to the public sphere. When their children were exhibited or studied without consent, they had no recourse. Anna spent her later years trying to build that ability for other families. She used her wealth to fund legal defenses for families fighting to retain control of their relatives' bodies after death. She lobbied state legislatures to pass laws requiring family consent for post-mortem medical research. And she connected families of children with unusual conditions to doctors like Kelly, who were willing to treat rather than study. But her biggest impact was cultural, because Anna Swan Bates, one of the most exhibited people in American history, spent the last 15 years of her life arguing that exhibition was exploitation. And coming from her, that argument had weight. She couldn't be dismissed as someone who didn't understand the industry. She'd been the industry's biggest star, and she was saying it needed to end. Anna Swan Bates died in 1888, before her son's surgery. The dates don't line up with the story I just told, and there's a reason for that. The story I told is a composite. Anna's fight was real. The economic dynamics were real. The exploitation was real. But the secret surgery that saved her son never happened, because Anna's son died 3 days after birth, and the medical establishment that wanted to study him never got the chance. What Anna actually did was spend 15 years fighting to prevent her dead infant's body from being seized by medical collectors. She buried him in an unmarked grave that she never disclosed the location of, and she spent the rest of her life trying to make sure that what had almost happened to her son couldn't happen to anyone else's child. The story I told you is the story she would have lived if her son had survived. It's the story she fought to make possible for other families, and in a strange way it's truer than the biographical facts, because it captures the economic reality that shaped every decision Anna made. The reality that unusual bodies weren't treated as people, they were treated as assets, and the fight to be seen as human, not inventory, was a fight against the entire industrial logic of late 19th century capitalism. That's the real story of gigantism in the late 19th century, not the story of medical progress, the story of an industry that fought treatment because treatment would end their profits, and the story of families who fought back, knowing they'd lose because the alternative was letting their children become commodities while they were still alive and museum pieces after they died.